call or whatever. Um, okay, well, welcome everybody. It's great to see you all, and we've got a good program today. We're going to be introducing Professor Sir Jeff Palmer. He'll be in conversation with Yasser Safari, and we've got um, possibly two short film clips to look at. We've also got with us Professor Sati Prakshak from Jos University, and he's prepared a PowerPoint presentation for us with his about one of his latest papers that he's been working on about African history written by Africans, knowledge production in a global and local space. So that's something to look forward to. And we're also going to dedicate, I was hoping that our colleague Jim would be with us. He spoke with us last week and spoke so fondly of his mother. So Yasser Safari will maybe be showing your video of one of your poems, My Mother Who Fathered Me. So let's see how we get on then. So what we planned to do this morning was to let Yasser Safari and Professor Jeff Palmer talk together. And Jeff, you have been working, spending so much time recently on the focus of Black Lives Matter. And so we want to hear about what you're doing there. So if it's okay, we'll go back from the screen sharing, Simon, and we'll let Yassus and Professor Sir Jeff Palmer get to know one another again. I don't know how recently you've spoken.
No, morning again, and thanks, Liz. No, well, listen now. Me and Professor Palmer really need to reacquaint, you know. We met about in 2008 in Birmingham.
Yes.
And I've been the beneficiary of his benevolence, of his love, of his fatherly guidance. We have kept in touch, and we have a bond that is, I would think, I have the audacity to say, will be unbroken. And so we're always in touch. I'm present in my absence as I am in his presence. And so we maintain it like that way. We wouldn't have it changing anytime soon. What say you, Prof?
Absolutely the same.
Yes.
We are one humanity, nothing less.
Naturally. And then to add some fuel to that is that we are really from the same parish in Jamaica, which is Saint Elizabeth.
Yes.
And I won't try to enumerate the accomplishment, the accolades, the professional achievement, the personal achievement. From the scientific perspective, he's been a world-class, renowned, groundbreaking professor and scientist to be the first person that actually got the credit of photographing the atom of the barley, among many others. That would take the whole program to enumerate. So we hope some of that will come out in the reasoning that we'll be having with the distinguished professor. But Prof, since I'm really, claiming my bragging rights to share the same parish of birth with you, let's start with just saying something about your parish of birth, your community, Monroe in St. Elizabeth, and how you transited from that space to Kingston, and then we'll come to the UK later on.
Okay, thanks, Yassus. Well, I was born in St. Elizabeth, as according to my birth certificate, in 1940. And I was born in an area called, I've looked at my birth certificate, and it says Monroe College District. And one of the important aspects of that is that Monroe is the Scottish Mountains. And therefore you also have Monroe College, which of course I didn't know about, but I'm very proud of the fact that I'm born not only in St. Elizabeth, but also there's a historical link with Scotland in there. in that I was born in Monroe's College District. I left St. Elizabeth very young, so I really haven't got a significant picture of St. Elizabeth itself, because my mother, she comes from Manchester. And I think my father, the Palmers, are from St. Elizabeth. So I dare say my mother went to, my father wanted me to be born in St. Elizabeth rather than Manchester, where my mother came from. So there was, of course, that kind of historical relationship and between the parishes and people from different parishes and the son, who the father seemed to have had the dominant say. But we left St. Elizabeth. I don't know when. It's one of these things I never asked my mother, so I really will never know. But I was taken to Kingston, and my father was a shoemaker, and he, of course, practicing his trade in Kingston. They lived there for some time, and then my father, like a lot of men did in the 40s, he went off to America to what they call farm working. And my mother then went and stayed with her sisters in Allman Town in Kingston. And that's how I grew up with my mother and my aunts. And when my mother left Jamaica in 1951, I was 11. And my brother was 9, and my mother left us with her sisters. And that was quite normal. My aunts looked after us. There was only one other child in the family, and there were probably about 10 of us in the house. And it was owned by a grandaunt. And she was very fair-skinned. We never really, these things didn't occur to me until I left Jamaica and the racism of the UK came to me, because my grandaunt was very fair-skinned. It was her house in Allman Town. We all lived there. And I said my mother left in 1951 when I was 11. And she came to London, worked hard, saved my fares, and got me to London in 1955. And when I arrived on my own in Paddington to meet her, I didn't recognize her. She recognized me. And I always remember the phrase, "Boy, I'm your mother, come." And that's after 4 years. So, and with my father, I never saw him again until 1975, when I was lecturing in New York. And he walked in with 3 of his friends at the back of the lecture, right up to the front, sat down. And then they got up and left when I'd finished lecturing, and I went out, and he said, "Do you know who I am?" And I said, "Yes, you're my father." And we made connection again until he died. So that's telling the little story of a story which is based on our history, because what I've said now applies to a lot of Black children who migrated. And that's the result of our history.
It's very interesting and still relevant and applicable in today's Jamaica and in today's world as well. Because interestingly, just a little bit of the geography of Monroe College District, since you have left, since you're a child. It's really on the top of a mountain, and Monroe College, one of the prominent high schools, secondary schools, though it's called a college. The other is Hampton High, and the other is Bethlehem Moravian Teachers College. Now, Monroe is on top of the mountain, very cool climate, similar to what you have in Malvern. Malvern is one of the 5 best climatic conditions to live in on the planet Earth.
Right.
And so you can stay at Monroe and see Manchester Parish on the top of that mountain range across. So maybe there were some synergies there, mountaintop to mountaintop in the whole African Maroon tradition. And so, interestingly, again, that marriage between St. Elizabeth and Manchester is interesting, because St. Elizabeth changed its border in the area of Alligator Pond just to give Manchester some water. I don't know if you're aware of this, Prof.
No,
but that's one of the,
no.
yeah, the historical.
That's very important. Yeah, because
very
on my
important.
birth certificate, Malvern is also mentioned.
Exactly. And so interestingly, St. Elizabeth, for its benevolence, changed the border to give Manchester water. And so we have that credit. I say it when growing up with Garnet Silk and some of the other artists, my thing was that St. Elizabeth baptized Manchester.
Right.
and so that relationship, that synergy between St. Elizabeth and Manchester still happens, because you would have known St. Elizabeth is a farming parish and Mandeville is inland, so it's not so much a farming parish as St. Elizabeth. So most of the people would migrate to Mandeville, and the marriages between the light-skinned people, since you alluded to your aunt being like that, were from St. Elizabeth, and the Manchesterians seem to revel in that sort of thing. So there's still that synergy between both parishes. However, interestingly, again, dovetailing to my next question, is that I know you have initiated charity support to some of the activities in Jamaica, including some of the activities for which I'm responsible. And so you have sponsored children to attend different events, such as education-friendly events, such as Poetry in Motion. You have donated through my company books, poetry books to students in respective parishes, St. Elizabeth and Manchester. So you still have that affinity and that love and that support. But talking about education, as an esteemed professor, very, very, very distinguished, world-traveled, I happen to know from my personal relationship with you and doing some background checks on you, that you're kind of a late bloomer as it relates to education. Can you tell us some more about that?
Well, when I was in Jamaica, like a lot of the kids there at that time, my mom left me with her sisters. And again, the main important activity was Sunday. You know, they went to work. They work as what were called domestics. So they went up to St. Andrews and work with white people. And some worked in a factory down in Kingston, which was making medicines, sort of, you know, from herbs at Regent Street downtown. So that was my aunts. They were working and all pooling together. Now, I just went to the local church school, and that was called North Street Congregational Church, and that's just next to the hospital. And the irony is, I just realized many years later that it is based at North Street and Princes Street. And Princes Street is...
And Prof, you're talking about the Kingston Public Hospital, that is, right?
Yeah, Kingston Public Hospital. Yeah, right. My church and schools next to the Kingston Public Hospital. But the two streets, one was North Street and Princes Street. And again, Princes Street is the main street in Edinburgh. And I had no idea of any historical links at that time. And the church has been there for nearly 200 years. I didn't realize that. But when I went, it was just my church and my school. And of course, one of the things that a lot of your people don't realize is that a lot of Black people coming out of slavery are Christians. And even one of our greatest rebellions was run by Sam Sharp and also Bogle, who had, you know, serious Christian beliefs. And therefore...
As well as our first national hero and the greatest Pan-African inspirator of all times, Marcus Mosiah Garvey.
Marcus Garvey, yes. So we all have come out of the most horrific, you know, enslavement with people like that and fought within that context. Now, therefore, myself, I was brought up where my aunts took me to church every Sunday. There was no getting out of it unless you were sick. And therefore, when you were sick, you had to take castor oil. So I never gave up. In fact, my phone is sitting on a New Testament, small New Testament, which I got as a prize at church in 47, 48. That was my first prize for anything, and it was for regular attendance and a church. And therefore, that's my background. educationally, I wasn't doing very much. I just went to school, and then I left North Street School, and I went to Kingston Senior School, which is at King Street near Racecourse. That's just near where I lived in Almontown. So those schools weren't preparing me for exams. So when I left Jamaica in 1955, I'd not passed anything, and I didn't expect to pass anything. And when I got to London, the reason why I'm talking to you today, and the reason all the work I've done for Guinness in Nigeria or in Japan, and the research I've done and the students I've taught, is based on 1 month. Because when I arrived, neither my mother and I knew in 1955 that I was below the school leaving age in London by 1 month. I was 14 years and 11 months. And when and this is why my mother, when people ask her about me, she says, he's God's vehicle, meaning that everything I've done is not within my control, because we were going out the door the next morning after I just traveled 5,000 miles on my own. And she took what, from 1951 to 55 to save £86 to bring me here. And of course, she got me a job. And she got me a job in a milk shop where I was going to deliver sandwiches, and which was nearby where we lived in North London. And we got to the door at 8 o'clock in the morning, the next morning. And there was a man standing at the door. And the man said to my mother, "Is that Godfrey Palmer?" Because my name isn't Jeff, it's Godfrey. And the man said, "Is that Godfrey Palmer?" And my mother says, "Yes, he's my son." And he said, "Where are you going?" And my mother said, "We're going to work." And the man said, "You can go to work, but he can't. He's not 15. And in those days, I should imagine there was an immigration guy who knew all black kids who had arrived. But 6 months later or a year later, they stopped that. I was fortunate. And my mother argued with him, said, "Look, it's 1 month, I'll keep him at home because I want him to go to work." And the man said, "I don't make the rules, he's got to go to school." So she took me to school, and the first school rejected me on the basis that I was educationally subnormal, ESN. And it was based on, they gave you some questions, and if you can't answer them, I dare say, you are educationally subnormal. And I was then taken to Shelburne Road Secondary Modern School near Nags Head in London. And they took me. And the headmaster says, "I won't take you for a month. You've got to stay 6 months because it's pointless 1 month at Easter." That's 6 months was part of the story, because had he taken me for 1 month, I wouldn't be here. And I spent that 6 months I didn't have any formal education in terms of exams before, so I just sat in the school. They weren't doing any exams anyway. This was a low grade school as opposed to grammar schools. And the turning point was one day the games teacher saw me playing cricket. And he said, "I'm going to take you for a trial in London." And he did. And the next morning he said, "You are playing for London. You've been selected." So I didn't know what that meant. He gave me some white clothes and shoes, and I played for London. And the fixtures of London schoolboys cricket team was Eton, Harrow, Winchester, which I didn't know what they were. To me, they were poor boys because they wore straw hats. But we played cricket. I did rather well. And I've got it on a table across there, where the Islington Gazette, the newspaper, published an article on me, saying I was this valuable schoolboy cricketer. That was the title, in 1955. And the local grammar school saw it and encouraged my mother to have me transferred to the grammar school just for a few years because the teacher needed a cricketer, the grammar school. And that's how I got into Highbury Grammar School. And I stayed there till 1958, from 55 to 58. And I then got a job at London University as a technician, a junior laboratory technician. And that's when my name changed because the professor at the interview, it was a good man. He just came in and said, "What's your name?" And I said, "Godfrey Henry Oliver Palmer." And he said, "Well, could I call you Jeff?" And I said, "No big deal." So he gave me the job. Interview took 5 minutes. And I worked for him. And one day he stopped me about 1959 and he said, "Somehow I don't think you are an ordinary little boy. I'm going to give you a half day off to get your A levels and O levels. And I want you out of this building by 1961. And I went, got the O levels and A levels, and I couldn't get into any British university. They all rejected me. And in 1961, I think it was August, I gave him the bad news. And he then phoned, he said, he put me outside his room and he came back out one Friday afternoon and he said, "You're going to Leicester University." So I got into Leicester University without filling up an application form. I was perfectly qualified, but couldn't get in. And I got an honours degree in 64. I went back to London, couldn't get a job. I went to the Labour Exchange and they gave me a job in peeling potatoes with an honours degree in botany. And I took it because I wanted to work. I taught my mother. So I peeled potatoes until Christmas, 1964, from June to Christmas. And I had this famous interview with the famous politician. It was #2 politician in Britain at the time. And he just said I should go home and grow bananas instead of trying to work in Britain. And I told him my first statement of self-belonging is it's difficult to grow bananas in Haringey in London. That meant I was going nowhere. I didn't get the job, but I was picked at an interview in Edinburgh in 1964 Christmas by Professor Anna MacLeod, a lovely woman. And she picked me on the basis that I didn't look like somebody who would bother her. She doesn't like people bothering her, but it was more than that. She checked my background and she applied what we call then wider access. And that brings us up to today, because here was somebody who's looking at what I'd been through and made a decision. And the decision she made is what we have today, because in terms of what I've done, I still support my church in Jamaica, the North Street Congregational Church. And one of the fantastic aspects of it, which you know a little about, Yassis, is that there was one of the most notorious slave-owning families. Because of contacts we had with them, supported my church. And also recently, over the last 2 years, 2 white families from Scotland who were slave owners and slave agents are now supporting my church in Jamaica significantly. And a lot of the talks I give, the funding goes to that church. Now, that's my link with the church still. But then I'll talk later now about what as this education I managed to get almost by accident. What have I used this education for?
Brilliant, boy. This is a story that deserves a movie. But anyhow, what happened is that, Prof, just tell us about your ascendancy in terms of the tertiary education, in terms of academia, in terms of the scientific world. building out from that honors degree in botany from Leicester University, and then that move to Edinburgh, where you still are located to this day. Just tell us a little bit about that ascendancy and that sense of accomplishment, obviously driven by your circumstances, obviously driven by your passion of history at God's vehicle.
Okay, well, there are two aspects to that, and I'll deal with them quickly so that, you know, we can get onto questions. My scientific life was that I left Edinburgh. I went and worked for the Brewers in a very important research institute in England, in Surrey. And it was there I developed what was called the abrasion process. So if you just type in the word abraded barley, 2 words, you will see it. And what it is, I used the scientific information I developed for my PhD in Edinburgh, and I applied it. And what I discovered was that the whole world thought when a grain germinates, it digests itself from the germ. And what I found was that it didn't. It digests itself using the bran that surrounds the grain. And using that concept, my view was if I could stimulate the bran, I could get the grain to digest quicker. And that's exactly what we did. And Bass Charrington's, the biggest brewery probably in the world then, and other breweries, and the concept, Carlsberg, Heineken, they've all recognized the concept that it wasn't what they thought. And the irony of that is, if we're linking it into Black Lives Matter and racism, the irony is that concept has dominated science. But the fact is that I don't think there are probably 2 people who've ever said it works. I've had a lot of research, people trying to prove it didn't work. And that's one of the ironies of racism, that you had something that is scientifically sound, industry was using it, but still you had people trying to say it didn't work, or it works, but I didn't know how it works. And that's one of the important aspects of the science, linking it with today. The other aspect is when Guinness had a problem in Nigeria, and we've got a colleague from Nigeria here today, and he probably knows some of the story, but maybe not all. But I had a phone call from the Guinness company, who owns Diageo, so it's one of the biggest companies in the world in terms of drink and business. And I had a call in the middle 80s to say, Jeff, we've got a problem in Nigeria. The government has banned the import of European barley and malt grain, and we have 4 breweries. Heineken had 5, and they had to close. And I went to Nigeria, and it was rather a great trip because it was returning after 200-300 years. And I went to Nigeria, I went to Maiduguri, I went to Jos, I went to Lagos, and came up with the concept that the company must use the local grain, sorghum, to make their beer in Nigeria, which people thought wasn't possible. And they did it. And that work, I'm told by a South African professor recently, has changed the African concept, where now companies are using local grain to make products for which they were importing grain. And therefore, what we have is the little education I had, paid for my mother with £86, has changed the way the world see a grain in Africa, which was regarded as inferior.
Yes, changing the scientific paradigm. And Prof, linking that now to how you got around to photographing the barley atom and making that scientific and historic initiative.
Jeff, you've managed to unmute yourself somehow.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, that's fine.
Well,
this is really
there are
good.
2 aspects to this, Yasis, is actually stating how a grain works. When the white view was it worked one way, And I say it worked another, and that's the way it did work, because that developed the technology. So that's terribly important, finding out that something works as God intended it to work. But the concept which they had didn't. It couldn't develop the technology, because technology is science that works. If you're doing anything in life and it doesn't work, the science is wrong. And therefore, that's what we did. And as far as the other aspect of what you're talking about, I used the scanning electron microscope for the first time in the world to show what a barley grain looks like inside.
Right.
And we did that in London, and it is now, you know, whole hat. But those are the two things that the wee black boy from St. Elizabeth, the product of slavery, and the essence of that is how many people brighter than me we've wasted, we've killed cutting sugarcane. And to me, why I say that is for that reason, that the fact that somebody who may have cured cancer, we killed cutting sugarcane, because the Professor Hume and Kant, and we are dealing with this now, and we can come to statues, they said Black people are inferior. And that's what killed George Floyd. That's what has destroyed the humanity, that concept which was a lie.
And what undermined the global economic potential of the different worlds, second and third world.
Absolutely.
As they are designated. And before we go to the statues then now, Prof, I wanted to speak briefly, as briefly as I can, about a similar recommendation that you made to the people of Jamaica, and which was disrupted by some of the so-called first world economies and first world countries, and that was to have the people in Jamaica in agriculture growing sorghum.
Yeah.
For our breweries here, and up to now that has not materialized. Can you briefly address that part of the experience?
Well, yes, that's absolutely correct. I remember one of my trips to Jamaica, I had a meeting with a group of gentlemen, you know, on a Friday night, and we were discussing this, and I said, sorghum, you know, I'd done the work in Nigeria, and I said, sorghum is a tropical grain. I went to India and discussed that with the Indian people in Hyderabad, looking at sorghum. It is the perfect grain for climate change. It doesn't need a lot of water to grow compared to maize. It's in fact very resilient. And therefore, we have got a product which is perfect for developing countries in terms of a tropical climate. And I just gave a talk on climate change, you know, in terms of race. And I said one of the most significant aspects of climate change is removing the forests in the Caribbean to plant sugarcane and coffee. And that's what causes soil erosion. That's what affects water distribution. And the point is that sorghum is perfect. It's designed for climate conditions where water is a difficulty. And therefore, I think we should look at that carefully.
Certainly, Prof. And then therefore, we want to now weave the different strands into the tapestry of the current situation with you in Edinburgh now. Because what happened is that Jamaica, for example, 80%, and I learned this from you, Prof, 80% of the names in our telephone directory are Scottish names.
Yes.
And that is because of the history. The Scottish were good bookkeepers, and the English were absentee landowners. And so the Scottish were installed as
managers, agents,
and agents. and had the power of attorney, you could say.
Oh, yes, very
And
much.
so, as a means of stock control, they would pass on the names to the enslaved people. Right. So now we have a situation in which we are weaving now science and history. But before we go into that historical concept now, as a scientist with a scientific background and training, obviously your personal experiences and the experience of an African in the diaspora must have inspired you to weave your scientific work with your now renowned work in history. I am aware that the University of Glasgow is currently making some preparatory work with the University of the West Indies, and you are largely instrumental in that connection. What brought about that fascinating marriage between your scientific work and your work as a historian?
Well, I'm glad you put it that way, because it's interesting that one of the approaches, and it's very sad, where we have very distinguished historians who have been attacking me by saying, and again, it's like my research work where people are saying, he doesn't know what he's doing, but it's done. The point is that there are many historians who are saying, but he's a brewer. I'm not a brewer. That's an insult. I mean, I've taught some of the best brewers in the world, but I'm not a brewer. The point is, it's trying to denigrate my contribution and to try and negate it. And that's one of the approaches but people have used to deny Black people their rights. And the point is that I have used my scientific training and abilities to look at this history critically. And therefore, some of the things that I found, and I will just relate some of them, and as you rightly put it, probably for the first time publicly, that my scientific training is probably one of the main reasons why I'm making this contribution. I think the vice principal of Edinburgh University also put that I am scientifically I'm qualified to do this work, as opposed to historians saying that I'm not. Now, what we've done with that, and we'll start with the outcome first, that I've been appointed by both the Scottish government. It's with great humility and an honour that the Scottish government and Edinburgh Council recently, just a few weeks ago, they both said they want me to chair committees dealing with statues, street names, galleries, museums, looking at these aspects of our history and actually find the truth and pass that truth on into education and to the people. Because I believe that education is the way out of changing racist attitudes which try to balance. There was slavery there, your slavery in the Caribbean, you've got a balance, so what are you complaining about? Each slavery must be treated separately. They must not be compared, because that's just a deceptive approach to stop progress. And that should just be removed. You see a lot of it on the Twitter or whatever, the media, Facebook or whatever. There's always somebody saying, what about African slavery? What about this and what about that? And I said, look at the governments who were managing slavery. In Europe, you have highly civilized, in inverted commas, governments making it illegal, saying that, that people quote cases like the Joseph Knight case, very famous case of the 1770s, where that is, I've even had that case used by a black person against me by saying the Joseph Knight case in Scotland abolished slavery before slavery was abolished in the Caribbean. Nonsense. That case is a showcase. It needs to be looked at because it's a case about a black young man brought from Jamaica, working as a servant. And this case he ran away. And the case ended up in the High Court of Edinburgh. And some of the most powerful law lords were involved in this case. Henry Dundas, Lord Auchinleck, Lord Arniston, Boswell was involved, Boswell and Johnson. For this case of this young black man, the point is that though it is regarded as an excuse for white people to do nothing, because they say this case shows we are good people, we abolished the slavery of Joseph Knight. What I've said is Joseph Knight was not a slave. I've also used the statement as factual. I said in 1774 to 1778, Joseph Knight had a white wife. Which slave in the Caribbean? You get killed in America to looking at a white person, not long ago. Therefore, in fact, my work is based on trying to remove those kinds of deception because they stop progress. And therefore, the Joseph Knight case, re-examining. When I asked a white professor who spent 3 hours lecturing about the Joseph Knight case and the legalities, I said, define Joseph Knight's slavery. He couldn't. He couldn't. He actually says, and I'm quoting, yes, he was in servitude, in other words, a slave. That case is taught to lawyers, and it is believed by people all over the world. And what I'm saying, it is invalid. It cannot be validated scientifically. So that's one instant where we have to look at the evidence related to statements. It's like the David Hume statements that black people are inferior. Psychologists today would try and verify that by using IQ tests, because it is to say black people are indeed inferior. And I'm saying the evidence is not there, it's invalid. And therefore, when we now come to the statues, we had probably one of the most famous statues in Britain, probably in the world, in the middle of Edinburgh. And that's the statue of Henry Dundas. Now, who was he? He was probably at one time the most powerful politician in the world. He was number 2 to Prime Minister Pitt. Pitt, the Prime Minister, this was his number 2. And he was operating politically at the same time as William Wilberforce. So if I say to you, have you heard of William Wilberforce? And you say yes. And I say to you, have you heard of Henry Dundas? And you say no. Then you know nothing about Wilberforce. Because this was the man involved in the Joseph Knight case as well. And what he said in the Joseph Knight case, people say, well, Dundas was involved in the Joseph Knight case, and he said Joseph Knight should be free. Therefore, he's a good man. Dundas said in the Joseph Knight case that Joseph Knight is free in Scotland or in Britain, but he's a slave in Jamaica. That's what Dundas said. They've left that out, that he said that. The judges of that Joseph Knight's case said in their judgment, Joseph Knight is free in Edinburgh, but if he's in Jamaica, and they use the word Jamaica, he would be a slave. So this is the same Dundas. Wilberforce put forward the bill that the slave trade should be immediately abolished. Dundas put in one word in the amendment: the slave trade should be gradually abolished, gradually. And we have a big debate today where Dundas put forward gradually to extend it indefinitely. And we have the academics at the highest level still saying Dundas was an abolitionist because Wilberforce's bill wouldn't have got through, but gradually made it get through. It didn't get through anywhere. It delayed it for 15 years. And it was only when Dundas was impeached in 1806 for taking Navy's money, he was impeached, that the slave trade was abolished the following year, 1807. The point is that I've had to argue, sit up sleepless nights, arguing, pointing that out. And what I've also now found, with my son helping me accessing information, and it's in one of those historians' textbooks. Dundas actually proposed to the Parliament a strategy to breed young slaves, males under 20 and girls under 16. It is not stated by historians publicly. He also, with his Governor Balcarres in Jamaica, and Balcarres had slave plantations in Manchester. My family still lives, my mother's family still live on Marshall Pen.
I know Marshall's Pen quite well.
That is Earl Balcarres' slave plantation. Dundas sent Balcarres to Jamaica to be in the late 1790s. And it is Balcarres that transported the Maroons to Nova Scotia. 500 of them, about. The point is that that's Henry Dundas's action, delaying the slave trade abolition, sending Balcarres to Jamaica to destroy the Maroons. He also, in fact, wanted to breed slaves, and he also got Balcarres to buy slaves to fight in his army in San Domingo, Haiti. And we have historians today saying he was an abolitionist, equating him to Equiano or Wilberforce. And that's the battle we have. Now, one of the success, as you've said, Glasgow University have looked at their history and of their own conclusion. They've received about 200 million from slavery. And they've set up educational reparation programs with the University of the West Indies and offering scholarships to Black kids here. The other significant achievement, not just of me, but of the people in general, we spent 3 years with Edinburgh Council discussing a new plaque for Henry Dundas to put the truth on it. And we failed. If George Floyd hadn't died, nothing would have happened. The council reconvened the committee and we came up with a narrative for that plaque in 5 days. And it does say that Dundas delayed the abolition of the slave trade, causing about 630,000 Africans to be transported into slavery. His descendant, Henry Dundas, is still arguing about that, but he hasn't got a case. The point is that the truth has worked, and we hopefully get that new plaque on his statue permanently, because the word slavery was never on his plaque for 199 years. So that's the achievement of my mother and her 86 pounds. And I think of it every day.
Oh,
Brilliant. Brilliant. But it's difficult.
Thank you to you both. That's been absolutely fantastic.
One
Just
moment, please. How we stay with time? We need to wrap up now?
Yes, please.
Okay, so fleetingly then, Prof, It's interesting that the University of the West Indies, based on the Mona campus, and that has its own historical significance as well, up to recently, and it was as a result of our agitation here, that they changed the visitor from the Queen of England to a Caribbean member of the judiciary. That is interesting. But again, going out, looking at the psychohistoriographical timeline as it relates to the hypocrisy and the deception, if you look at the Berlin Conference and you look at emancipation in the different territories, fast track that forward to this day with the independence movement, and in particular in Jamaica, after 50-odd years of independence, we still retain the governor, who is pretty much a governor general. We still retain the head of state of Britain, who is still the head of state of Jamaica. So that again is consistent with the sort of deception you alluded to, and hypocrisy, and the fact that there are a lot of work need to be done. And in dismantling the statues and correcting the information at the statues, we need to dismantle and decolonize systemic racism, the parliament, the government, the education, the global social and political constructions that emanate from the transatlantic genocide and the transatlantic slavery and colonialism, to reconfigure that triangle of death and genocide and decay to one of healing, reconciliation, caring and sharing in the interest of our shared humanity and our shared planet Earth. And with our shared planet Earth, we need climate justice, which must be rationalized and harmonized with social justice. It was really an honor, Professor Jeff Palmer, and a delight. It would be evident to you, Liz, as well as to myself and all of us, that we need a part 2 sometime soon, because we're just getting into the meat of the matter. And Prof, thanks for your benevolence, your brilliance, your impeccable memory at 80 years young. And all the best of success with that work. Couldn't be designated to a more deserving person. Honor, love, and prosperity. We thank you.
Thank you very much. God bless.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Palmer, for having that conversation with Yassus. I feel as if we've really connected together again. We met in Scotland. You hosted us very graciously one time those years ago. So that was really good. Thank you so much, Yassus. That was great. And yes, I would like to extend the invitation for a part 2, please, Professor Palmer. I checked in my diary and the 11th of December is free. I don't know what you're doing at Friday lunchtime.
Well, I'll have to check my diary.
Again. All right, we'll have a chat about that then. Thank you so much. That was absolutely brilliant. And I'm sure we're all doing a big round of applause. Thank you so much. And then we'll have the questions the next time, or you can put questions on the chat. But not only are we really honoured to have Professor Sir Jeff Palmer with us today, but we've also got Professor Sati. I knew I'd get it wrong. We've got Sati, our very good friend from Jos University, Professor Sati Watchak, and he is going to make a start, I think. We can have a part 2 here as well, I think, on African history written by Africans. Now, we've been very delighted to have had Sati join us over these last few weeks, because this really is important that we address this issue, that we need to understand better African history as written by Africans. So I'm not going to say anything else. I'm just going to pass over to you, Professor Watchak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz, and thank you everyone who has the time to listen to what I've concocted in the past few days. So, Liz, how many minutes do I have to make this presentation?
We've just got about half an hour to the end of the session, and please take that time to
Okay.
use as you wish.
Okay.
It's difficult not to have time with questions, but I think we've bitten off a bit more than we can chew this time with two such brilliant folks to join us.
Okay. So, will Simon be controlling the
Yeah.
PowerPoint from there? Okay. Okay. As you can see from the title, I'm trying to look at African history as written by Africans. This is from part of a paper that I did on trends in African historiography. And so I just removed this small part to discuss with you. The paper is like 50 pages, so it's so enormous. So I just want to focus on these few areas concerning Africans. So African history has been part of um, African way of life for a very long time. And it has been part of the writing traditions of Africans. So most often people believe that African history started being written only during the colonial period, but that is really, really incorrect, or started being written with the coming of the Arabs, but that is also wrong. As you can see from the slide, African history has been in written form, although much of it in an inferred form than in the systematic manner it is being written today. So the writing forms, we are all conversant with the Egyptian hieroglyphics, but there are also other forms of writing like rock painting, rock art in North Africa, where the Garamantes promoted it, in East Africa, in Southern Africa. They were people who wrote, made some engravings on rocks. And then in Nigeria, we have what was called Nsidibi. Nsidibi is some kind of monolith carved on wood and some other objects by artists. And these were also historical writings to some extent. And then the Yoruba had what was called Odu. It was also some kind of ritual writing. And then among the Chadic speakers on the Jos Plateau, where I come from, there were some divination patterns. And these were reflections of early forms of writing. And then in Liberia, there was the Vai language. Now, these were not strictly historical texts, but they have now today constituted sources of history. And so history could only be inferred from them, as you can see from the hieroglyphics, whereas the writer is talking of I watch over, I watch over, I watch over. Now, I watch over is a historical statement. And of course, the writing is rendered in hieroglyphics. So the themes of those writings reflected the experiences of individuals, the experiences of communities, their social life, their economic life, their religious life, and so on and so forth. So these were not basically 100% historical texts, so history could only be inferred from them, but they constituted part of African history. Yeah. Next slide, please. Now came the age of European imperialism, when African history was dominated by the writings of explorers, by the writings of merchants, by the writings of missionaries, colonial administrators, linguists, anthropologists, and so on. Now, the period of European dominance of African historiography was a period between the 15th and the early 20th century. Now, this was when these particular writers were documenting their activities. Explorers, as we know, people like Livingstone, people like Mungo Park, and so on, documented their activities, and they did write about the people they saw in Africa. Traders, like people who engage in the slave trade, people who are engaged in the legitimate trade, also documented their activities, and these they wrote also about Africans. And then missionaries also wrote accounts about Africa, and so on and so forth. And then the colonial administrators, after the conquest, they also wrote a lot of things, some of which are archived in Britain and in the metropolitan countries. But while colonial historiography tended to look at Africans from the perspective of Europe, which had been destroyed over 400 years of slavery, and described Africans as barbaric, described Africans as backward, described Africans as sinners, and so on. At that colonial period also, there were local histories, and these local histories are reflected in what we call tarikhs. They are reflected in jihadi accounts, and they are reflected in the accounts of the patriots. The next slides will deal with those. Yeah, in the 16th to the 19th century, there were many historical writings called tarikhs or chronicles. And the examples are, as you can see, Kilwa Chronicles, Kano Chronicles, Ginja Chronicles. There were also chronicles of Walata, Borno, Timbuktu, Funj, and so on. Now, these chronicles were basically local histories written in Arabic script. So it means these were accounts of Africans, mainly Africans, but they were using their knowledge of Arabic to write those accounts. And in one of the accounts, one of the writers was cursing Opukuwari and asking that God should take him to hell because he conquered Gonja and because he was said to have been brutal. Now, this gives a perspective of the Islamization of those parts of Africa where the tarikhs were written. And because the perspective was from the perspective of the Arabs, even though these are Africans, it now shows that Islam had become a part of life, a way of life of those people, and therefore they were writing with that kind of background. But fundamentally, tarikhs were eyewitness accounts written mainly by Africans, and they were about the stories of African peoples. Next slide, please. Next slide, okay. Now, apart from those tarikhs, also in what we can call the period of colonial historiography, many Africans who were products of slavery, they wrote accounts about their lives or where they came from or their encounters back in Africa and then also in Europe. One is the popular or known story of Oloide Equino, who wrote about how he was enslaved and how he became a slave and so on and so forth. And then another was the Ghanaian who was taken to Germany, and his Dr. Will Anton. Now, he wrote a PhD in which he made a case for accepting the civilizations of Africans as contributing to world civilization. And he wrote about the Moors in North Africa in particular and claimed that they contributed to the development of Europe. So you could see Africans in the diaspora who were slaves inserting African history into the global spaces from their own backgrounds because they came from Africa and they were inserting African history into the global spaces. Yeah, next slide, please. Now, apart from the ex-slaves, there were also local accounts of jihadists. We know of Usman Danfodio, we know of his son, Mohammed Bello, and we know of his brother, Abdullahi. They all wrote accounts talking about why the jihad had to be fought, the principles of Islamic government, the nature of oppression of Hausa society, and why the jihad had to be fought. And then Abdullahi, for example, wrote his own account in which he traced his own genealogy and also accounted for how he participated in the wars. And then Mohammed Bello also wrote the same thing. He wrote the biography of his father and also included the jihadi wars. Within them, they are said to have written about 257 works on the jihad in terms of letters, in terms of various forms of writing. So the jihad was very documented, and it was from the perspective of the authors, or the perspective of the actors themselves. Yeah, next slide, please. Now, apart from those, there were other people who were concerned about the sustainability of the knowledge of African history and culture, that the knowledge of history of Africa should not die. It should not be lost. And one of those authors was Carl Christian. And from the slide, you can see he said this, the sole object of this publication is to call attention of all of you, my friends and countrymen, to the study and collection of our collective history. And if you look at what Samuel Johnson said, it was also something similar, a purely patriotic motive that the history of our fatherland lost in oblivion. Akiga said the same thing about the thief. He was alarmed that if the older generation died and then their history was not recorded, then thief history would be lost. So he was making a case that the history should be preserved.
Okay, have we lost you, Professor Sati?
Seems to have frozen up, but hopefully he will come back. I think we.
Right, this is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right, it looks on my screen as if he's dropped out to the thing at the moment.
It looks like
it's coming back in again.
Good. Good.
Right, so it's fascinating. Right, you're back again, Sati.
Sorry, my network broke. I'm so sorry about that.
We're having a little bit of difficulty with your microphone. Can you make sure you're not knocking against it?
No, I'm not.
Okay, all right.
Am I clever now?
It's breaking up a little bit.
Yeah, it's the network, because my network broke and it's just coming
back.
back.
Of course, yes. We do understand. We're asking a lot of these technologies to cope. Okay, shall we go on to the next slide then now, Sati?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, next slide then. Simon's frozen up now.
You can skip this. Yeah, so within what can be called colonial discourse, there was the Eurocentric view and the Africanist view, which I've presented. So the Africanist view is not actually a post-colonial discourse. It has been on for some time. Now, can take next slide, please. Now, what we now call post-colonial African history or historiography, which is much known among scholars, is something that developed in the mid-20th century. And its highlight is that mainly professional historians are the drivers of this particular process. And during the Cold War, two major strands of this kind of scholarship emerged. Those that focus on empirical research, they were called empiricists, or their opponents call them the cult of facts. And then those who believe that historical information, historical data must be interpreted in Marxist terms. Both of these strands of scholarship were branded in various schools, Ibadan, Makerere, Kenya, Nairobi, Dakar, and so on, while the Marxists were largely found in Dar es Salaam and ABU in Nigeria. Regardless of how they interpreted African history, they were very strong methodologically. They were very strong in terms of depth and breadth. They were very strong in terms of global presence and competitiveness. And their research was accepted worldwide. It had rigor, and so it was accepted everywhere in the world. And the kinds of issues they treated were thematically diverse. They dealt with economic history, they dealt with social history, they dealt with cultural history and whatnot. And then in terms of period of coverage, they also dealt with pre-colonial history, they also dealt with colonial history, and they also dealt with post-colonial history. So this is the foundation of the thematic diversity of African historiography. Next slide, please. So I just want to look at a few of the persons that made Africanist historiography in the post-colonial period possible. One of them in the so-called Ibadan school or the Empress school is Kenneth Onwuka Dike, K.O. Dike. He is regarded as the father of Africanist historiography. He published his dissertation in 1956 with the title Trade and Politics in the Niger Delta. That book is definitive in several respects. It can pass for economic history, it can pass for political history, it can pass for, I mean, it's just simply an introduction to African history. And he began to look at the possibility of using oral traditions. Of course, it will take to 1961 for Jan van Sina to explain it, to modify it, to make it a systematic tool for the study of African history. So KODK launched this very important way of analyzing African history from the African perspective, not from the outsider perspective. And that has been very definitive. After him, some of his colleagues in various places that would appear on the different slides would be J.F. Ajayi, also of Ibadan. You would see people like Kizabo. You would see people like Adubo Ahen, and you would see Bethwell Obot, and also, so these guys interpreted history from the African perspective. Let's know Africa. Europeans have distorted our history. Let's straighten it. Let's give our people a voice. And this was exactly what they did and changed the narrative. Next slide, please. Yeah, I've talked about these guys. They belong to the same generation as Kenneth Dike, and their story is the same. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is also Kizabo, Bethwell, Ogot, and Czech, Anta Diop. They also interpreted history along the same line. So they are all the same. Next slide, please. Now, the alternative explanation to African historiography came from the 1970s when Marxists said the essence of history is not just to assemble a lot of data, but to interpret it and to transcend it. And by that, they meant that gathering facts alone was not enough. We have to use those facts to change African history, to change the conditions of the masses, according to them. So they were calling for a revolution in Africa because they complained about the bourgeoisie, both local and international. They complained about social classes. They complained about oppression. And they said that all these things had to change. And they did that through their work. One of the leading lights in that respect was Walter Rodney, who came from Guyana and was teaching at UDSM, University of Dar es Salaam. Now, Dar es Salaam became the hub of Marxist historiography. And in fact, it is believed that it is from Dar es Salaam that Marxism also was imported to Ahmadu Bello University with Yusufu Bala Usman as the kingpin because he was the head of the Department of History. And so he brought two Tanzanians, Temu and Temu and Bonaventure Swai. So they came and joined ABU and then developed Marxism in ABU. Now, some of the other people in ABU were someone like Professor Monde Mangvat, who was supervised by the Tanzanians. So their scholarship revolves around classes and class struggles, oppression, injustice, and the need to carry out a revolution. Unfortunately, the revolution could not be achieved because the masses whom they were talking about, the peasants, the workers who are not working in private establishments, the workers were mainly in public establishments, and the farmers were on their farms. So it became very difficult to galvanize them towards a revolution. Next slide, please. In the post-colonial era, in the post-Cold War era, African historiography went into some kind of a problem. There was a crisis because of the structural adjustment, but then we have the African diaspora that kept the faith alive, and then the thing also research. Next slide, please. Now, in the age of the SAP, many things went wrong. African economies were sluggish, they were not growing. It affected education, and it posed a lot of problems for the education sector. And I take this quotation from a Tanzanian who complained that there were budget cuts as a result of the SAP, and then libraries could not maintain international subscriptions. The journals became infrequent or occasional publications, and there was also a lot of problem like the brain drain. And so the SAP period, that is the period of structural adjustment in the mid-80s, became a very big problem for African historiography. Many scholars couldn't write good essays. Many couldn't publish their PhDs. Many couldn't get scholarships. And the study of history was really, really affected so badly. So the quality of historical knowledge, the quality of historical writing, and many other areas in the knowledge industry became difficult to attain. Next slide, please. Now, amidst this difficulty, to stand in the gap was the African diaspora, who continued with the tradition of knowledge production for Africa, even outside Africa. They had the grants, they had good facilities, they had good pay. Many of them left during the SAP period, like Toyin Falola. Toyin Falola is today Africa's foremost historian who has published hundreds of books, hundreds of articles, and he has written mainly on Nigeria and on various topics in Africa. So he has maintained the tradition of publishing good essays and maintaining African history. He also maintains what he's called the University of Texas Africa Annual Conference. By 2020, it was in its 20th year. So that conference has been going on. Next slide, please. Another African diaspora scholar is Tiambe Zeleza, the author of The Modern Economic History of Africa that won the Noma Award. He has been very terrific and he has been very commanding in writing African history. Among the females, we have Wando Achebe, who wrote a book, The Female King of Colonial Nigeria, giving African history a feminist perspective. So these scholars have been promoting African history from Europe and from America. Next slide, please. Now, at home, despite what happened during the SAP period, in the 21st century, there seemed to have been some kind of resurgence with local scholars engaging in writing history acceptable to various parts of the world. They're producing also for the global market. And I just use one of the examples, Egodi Uchendu. She's the immediate past president of the Journal of the Historical Society of Nigeria. She moved the journal to a very enviable level. She has been publishing, she has been writing, and her latest book is this one below, that is Nigeria's Resource Wars. And it just came out of the press. And you can see she is writing also on masculinities. She's writing also on Islam. So the tradition of diversity, thematic diversity, inherited from the post-colonial historiographers has continued to be maintained. And the tradition of good scholarship is returning. We may not get it back to the level of the 1970s, but some people are doing very good work. Next slide, please. So how do we explain the resurgence of local scholarship? One is the diaspora factor. Apart from writing books, they have been encouraging people to go to Europe and America for conferences, and the proceedings are published after peer review processes. So they have been promoting, and then some have been promoting the publication of good PhDs written in Africa. Falola, for example, has published a lot of PhDs written in Africa that are good. And then the state has also been giving scholarships Like in Nigeria, we have TED Fund scholarships for conferences. We have TED Fund scholarship for publications, and they also have travel grants. Then we have bodies like Codesria that are also promoting social science research in Africa. Some historians have published there and have benefited from that process. We have external donors like the Commonwealth that offers scholarships. We have that. We have scholarships also from China, from France, and so on that are offered by the embassies. We have Fulbright alumni, Fulbright scholarships or fellowships. And then we have the American Council for Learned Societies that in the last 10 years has been promoted humanities scholarship in Africa. I am a member of that organization. I'm a mentor in that organization. And in the last few days, we've been running workshops for people to write very good dissertations. I think we've come to the end of the slide, except to run over the conclusion, which is to say, to repeat, that from time immemorial, African history have partly been written by Africans. Africans have contributed to the writing of their own history using traditional methods or indigenous methods of writing, which were embedded in their texts. During imperialism, Europeans did not dominate the scene completely or did not have a monopoly. Africans contributed to that through their tarikhs, through their chronicles, through the works of the patriots, through the works of those who wanted African history not to be lost. And in the post-colonial period, we have had professional historians driving the process, coming through thick and thin, and the process is still continuing. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for being such a brilliant timekeeper. Thank you. What I'm going to suggest now, while we just take all that information in, is that we formally wrap up this session. I'll just say some thank yous, and then we'll finish the recording. And then we've got time when we can ask questions more informally, if that's okay with everyone. So many, many thanks to you indeed, Professor Watschak. Just absolutely brilliant, and information there that, gosh, I've not heard of before. So fascinating. Thank you so much for presenting that. Thank you. And for our earlier part of the session, many, many thanks to Yasser Safari, who's joining us from Jamaica, for that fascinating conversation with Professor Sir Jeff Palmer. Thank you so much, Professor Palmer. That was absolutely excellent, and again gave us such insights into your life. And last week we Dr. Jim Zakadorin is with us again today. But last week he had an opportunity and he started telling his story. And I think it is so important that the stories are told, so that we get a real understanding. So what I'm going to suggest is that we wrap the session up now. Thank you very much indeed for everybody for being here. If we switch the recording off, then we can carry on with some questions.